Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Indy Real Estate Investing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Tallman, and with me today is Trent Paino from Housemaster Home Inspections here in Indianapolis. Welcome to the show, Trent.
Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to being on it and hopefully giving some good answers.
Yeah, so I brought you on here today, Trent, to give our listeners some insight into the inspection world in central Indiana here in today's market. I want to get into some issues that you see as some deal killers. Some of those may be obvious, but you may have a different perspective on it. And maybe at the end, maybe what buyers and sellers can both do proactively to head off and maybe prevent these deals from dying during the inspection phase. Because our brokerage does not like, obviously, mutual releases and wherever they happen. But we know, and investors know this, and sellers know this, that most, I don't know if most, but a lot of deals, if they die, end up dying at the inspection phase. And it's a shame because there's time invested, there's money invested, and when those deals die, no one really wins. But before we get into that, Trent, just give everyone a quick rundown of what led you to Housemasters, which is a franchise, right? Housemasters is over the country. And so what led you into the inspection world?
Yeah, well, it is a franchise, but it's a family business here, locally. It's me and my parents. Mm-hmm. We got into home inspections in 2010, so we're into that 16th year of doing this. But prior to that, still in family business, we were, mostly my dad at that time, but focused in the senior housing realm. And so with that, there was anything from property management to the construction side, even, developing those properties. So I'd always been around homes and construction at all different facets. Certainly my dad has more experience than I do, but it was one of those easy kind of transitions of skill sets and knowledge is, well, let's see what this inspection side of it looks like. And it was kind of a plan B at that time in our portfolio that then turned into plan A.
Gotcha.
And so here we are with a good team of inspectors and support and out pretty much all over central Indiana doing this.
Great. So I'll start off with a fun one. What's the craziest thing you've ever seen in a home inspection? Just curious, what stories do you have? Or maybe ones your dad has told you.
Yeah. It's strange because usually my mind does not go to home conditions when that question is asked.
Yeah.
It's the fact that, we're going into somebody else's home and experiencing how, people live and what they have. So the craziest things are usually focused on that. A stuffed mounted mountain lion,
Wow.
as far as, a hunter really getting after it. It was a mountain lion on a rock, full size, right there, kind of in their dining room. Then to a home that we found in the basement was kind of a hidden door, a little passageway. And then there was two of us on the inspection. So the other inspector found this door in the basement, followed this hallway and kept going and found himself in a different house.
Yeah.
And so we learned and figured out that it was a family and they wanted a way to get to and from these two houses without having to go outside. So I had to call him. I'm like, "Where are you?" He's like, "I'm in the house." I'm like, "No, you're not."
Yeah.
Where are you? So that the inspection conditions, it's always, the foundation walls that are, falling apart or, the extreme things like that. But when I think craziest, it's usually something that a person has or how they're living. So
Yeah. All right. Well, good. So, a few years ago, Trent, and you've been doing this a while. So there were so many deals done that home buyers did not even require an inspection. They were waiving inspection, saying, "I want your house so bad," because there was this, fever pitch, huge seller's market back then, and inspections were waived. But I'm assuming now you're busier. Did that affect your business back then? Because it's changed so much since just a few years
Yeah.
ago.
And it definitely is a change, and markets shift quickly and rapidly. But back in that time period, we were still very busy, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a result of what you mentioned is just the extreme volume of sales in that time. So, we still were running at a pretty good clip. There was a good portion of those, when the industry talks about waiving the inspection, a lot of times that's referencing the buyer's ability to negotiate
Right.
or at what level to negotiate. So there was a good percentage of people that we would go into that inspection in those years and they say, well, I can't negotiate on anything, but we're still going to do this for my peace of mind. Or ultimately, their decision is, I just don't buy the house and we try to get a mutual release, which, as you mentioned, nobody likes to hear that. What we're seeing now is that now that we're 4 or 5 or so years away from that time period, we're hearing and experiencing a lot of, now those people are selling their house and they're kicking themselves because they didn't have an
Hmm.
inspection, whether they had the ability to negotiate it on it or not. And depending on the market trends and where we're at, our busyness kind of shifts from, new construction to existing homes. If things really shift, then we start doing a lot more for investors and portfolios. But yeah, I mean, even now, there will be times where we go into an inspection and the buyer or agent says, hey, we're doing the full inspection, but, we can't negotiate on any single item less than $2,500 or $5,000. And so that's still, far and few between right now. But yes, busy. We're in the spring, summer. I encourage listing agents at this point in time to kind of push their inspection response window to more like the 10 or 12 day turnaround rather than that 7 day,
Hmm.
because all inspection calendars are kind of pushed to the brim in this time period. But yeah, we're starting to see those people that waived inspections are now paying for it a little bit.
Yeah, that kind of takes me back to when Scott and I, my business partner and I, when we flipped homes and we bought most of our homes through sheriff sales. So there's no inspections at a public auction when you buy a home like that. And, we did in most cases, or in a lot of cases, I'll say, completely rehab these homes, but we
Yeah.
never had them inspected like you guys inspect them. And so even though we did everything we could think of to a house to make it as attractive and safe and all that good things, during the inspection, we'd always find things that we just couldn't see. We didn't have the ability or the skill or whatever to really get into these houses and inspect them the way you guys do. So it kind of reminds me now of people that didn't have those inspections. I think that's an interesting point that now they're having to kind of pay the piper for
Oh, yeah.
just getting in the house because that's what they had to do. We, face it, that's just the market that we had back then. So, Trent, what's the most common inspection issue you see with your inspections here in Central Indiana?
Uh, the most common, it usually falls on the simple things, those cliche deferred maintenance items that
Yeah.
just stack up and pile up. And a lot of times, the longer that list gets, or the longer the report gets with those deferred maintenance items, because there's still, conditions, the more nervous that buyer gets,
Mm.
whether it's a honey-do item that, is pretty simple, or maybe a contractor needs to be involved that makes that list longer on that deferred maintenance. But GFCIs, outlets and the GFCI ground fault protection is extremely common. I think that gets into a lot of people doing remodels of kitchens and bathrooms themselves.
Mm.
And they get that circuit and that outlet backwards, and it then becomes a safety item that's not functioning. I think, thermal seal windows, when you think about common, thermal seal windows is, a lot of people shrug it off and it's not that much of an energy loss. And that's true, but it certainly doesn't make your living room look great from the inside or outside. And when you start having multiple of those throughout the house, but
Yeah.
a lot of cosmetic stuff. And that kind of goes into our new construction homes is if it's new, it needs to be new, and the cosmetic stuff adds up as well, whether it's, curled carpet or little cracks here and there, nail pops and things like that. So I think it's generally going back to encouraging homeowners to keep up on the normal seasonal maintenance. And that stuff then prevents the big ticket items, down the road.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Our clients are typically long-term investors, and we preach and we allow them all kinds of different programs to join on to for preventative maintenance. So we offer HVAC, we offer gutter cleanings, all kinds of different preventative maintenance things that we feel will keep your house and operating better, give your resident a better experience. And then,
Yeah.
like you mentioned, when you go to sell, mitigating or at least reducing the number of items you have to repair for a buyer, and maybe even keeping a deal together, because it could be a death of a thousand cuts, right? You kind of mentioned that, where it's like, okay, we have
Yeah.
this. Nothing in itself maybe is crazy, but it's like there's 40 things. And it's like, wow, had there been half that, could the buyer have been more willing to take that on or at least stay in the game? So I think that makes a lot of sense. Trent, do you have any sense of how many times your inspections actually kill deals? I don't want you to have this reputation of a deal killer, but like, do you have a sense of that, or are you kind of just out of the picture and you deliver your report and you move on?
Uh, the natural progression is we're typically not brought back into that conversation at that point in time. We're a service provider in the industry for that day and time, and so there's a lot of instances where we don't even hear the follow up of how some of the big ticket items are addressed and negotiated or repaired. We don't get that loop coming back to us. And so we don't really know, unless months down the road, an agent, at a conversation says, oh, yeah, that deal fell apart and it was, this, that, or the other.
Yeah.
I do want to clarify, on this side of the line, being on the home inspection side of the transaction, I always say the inspection doesn't kill the deal. It's the house.
Yeah. Right. You're the
It's
messenger.
the house
Yeah.
killed that deal.
Yeah.
We just happen to be the one in line to put it in writing and take a picture of it.
Yeah.
The other thing that kills deals is the buyer.
Mm.
Buyers either not being coached properly through the transaction, not being given the proper expectations of what this inspection is and the intent of it is. So those buyers that probably should have been notified that, hey, this is an older house. It's been, added onto and remodeled for the last 60 years. It's an older couple that's selling it. So there's a whole likelihood that nobody's been in that crawl space. And, having those conversations from the real estate agent side long before I show up on the day of inspection. And yeah, we can kill deals, but usually it's the obvious of we're just pointing out something that has sat there for 20 years and it used to be a maintenance item. Well, now it's a water intrusion item and your foundation is a result of it. So we don't really have a good number on that.
Right.
And that would, be the agent then pulling us back in the loop to say, hey, just wanted to let you know
Yeah.
the buyer walked away and here's why. So we hear very little of that unless it's just a really, really ugly, nasty situation and they need us to know it. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, there's a lot of reasons why buyers walk away from homes, and it does happen usually around that inspection time period. And that's because we're uncovering things that nobody has asked about or addressed in many, many years.
Yeah. Absolutely. It totally makes sense. Are there common items, like if you had to say these are the top three reasons that why deals fall through, or top five or whatever? Are there some
Yeah.
commonality that you say, yeah, every time this happens, this deal usually is going to die?
Mold. I'll put mold at the top of that list. It doesn't scare me. I've been around this industry, not only inspections, but property maintenance and upkeep for many years, but mold typically is at the top. It's just people get nervous, health, safety, mold, why is it there? I think um, roofs, shingles, roofs is another big one. We've been hearing that more and more where insurance companies are tightening their belts
Yeah.
on just the general age of the roof, whether they're not going to insure it. There may be higher premiums or a different type policy for it. But we've hearing situations here the last few years where that buyer just can't get their homeowner's insurance because of the age of the roof. And they say, well, the seller's just got to replace it. Well,
Yeah.
roofs aren't cheap,
No.
and sellers aren't in a position to, cash out of pocket, replace a roof. And we've been preaching that a little bit more in the recent years as our insurance industry has changed and say, hey, we put age and we put comments on age on some of this stuff for a reason is you may need to ask some follow-up questions to the other side of the industry, being that insurance side.
Yeah, there's no doubt that insurance companies are cracking down on roofs. We've had clients reach out saying that they renewed their policy, they had someone go out and the roof is no longer insurable. We've had to, in the last few years, I know of several cases where we have had to replace a roof because of an insurance requirement. And that never used to happen. I mean, maybe if it was like there were holes in the roof and things like that, but these are, if you looked at it, you wouldn't necessarily say, wow, that roof is in horrible shape. But insurance companies are getting much more cautious about roofs, and we're seeing that.
Yeah.
Trent,
It's
yeah, go ahead.
unfortunate because the function of a roof is to prevent water leaks.
Yep.
So when you look at a roof and say, well, is it functioning or is it not functioning? Well, there's a lot of surface damage or a lot of deterioration and a lot of things that we point out that need repaired or buttoned up. But in fact, is that roof still functioning? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think the one thing I might push back a little bit on that, because if you get to the point where your shingles are maybe outside their normal lifespan or they're just starting to show a lot of wear, if you do that proactively, you probably have a much better chance of not having to replace any of the decking, right? So if you let a shingle deteriorate, and then basically your decking becomes your 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 biggest, yeah, your biggest, basically your roof, then over time, as we know, plywood won't withstand water for a long period of time. That deteriorates. So when you finally get around to replacing this roof, you spend significantly more because you're replacing all the decking. Whereas if you'd been a little more proactive, done it a year before or 2 years before, you could have saved yourself some money. And that's how Scott and I have looked at it before. It's like, yeah, this roof isn't leaking, but we know our plywood is probably in danger. Our decking is probably in danger. So it's just something to think about there. Trent, are there some, you may call some, you talked about roofs, you talked about mold, and most of the time you're taking a picture of that and your people are seeing it, and it's real obvious in some cases. Are there any silent killers out there that I mentioned before where Scott and I really, go through these, we used to go through these homes very carefully and remodel them and rehab them and improve them, but there's just certain things we can't see. Like, what silent killers out there that, a seller may say, I've done everything I know to do to my house. I've done all my preventative maintenance. I'm doing everything I can. But there's just certain things that you get into the guts of these things and you find. Just curious what those silent problems may be.
Yeah, not necessarily silent, but crawl spaces, an area that people don't generally go into and they kind of, out of sight, out of mind. So a lot of crawl space issues pop up. I think then outside of that full home inspection, a lot of buyers have, radon tests completed. It is odorless. It is, you're not going to see it. You're not going to touch it, feel it, but that radon gas and that test can come up in question. The one more popular service that is coming about is sewer scoping.
Mm.
What does that main drain condition look like underground? And that's another big ticket item, on property is if we have issues, then it's usually not cheap. So sewer scoping, which, these things fall outside of that standard full home inspection. Um, a lot of times it could be things inside an electric panel, that they just haven't been aware of. There's a lot more to that system than just the breaker or the outlet. We're required to remove that cover panel to identify what type of wiring and the condition of wiring. And so some things like that. But, as far as silent, a lot of people don't realize, like, for example, in an attic, um, air movement and air ventilation and circulation, if you've painted your soffits 12 times over the years and now you've blocked those screens and vents, it doesn't take long for that attic to build up with humidity and moisture, and then we then are dealing with that mold conversation. So
Yeah.
a lot of homeowners that are doing DIY projects, and they're good intentions. Maybe someone goes up and puts in more insulation on a weekend and they want to, get their energy efficiency a little bit better, but they block all the venting. Well, you've just potentially caused a pretty big problem without even knowing it. And 3 years later, we come in and the decking is all discolored and growing patterns of things. So
Yeah.
a few of those items.
Yeah. You talked about radon, and radon's not a problem all over the country, right? There are parts of the country that radon is not a big issue for buyers and sellers, but in Indiana it is. So
Yeah.
just a pro tip: our soil contains radon, and so if you're buying a home
Yeah.
here, even if it's on a crawl space for sure, basement 100%, you need to do it. But even
Yeah.
we have seen radon come back high on slabs.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it's just important that people know that if you're buying a home here, you should invest. It's not a lot of money, but should invest in that inspection to get radon tested, because if you don't, your buyer will down the road probably.
Yeah.
So it's better to have
Yeah.
someone else pay for it, take that out of the picture, because those things now are well over $1,000, I think, to install a radon system. But I'm sure you do
Yeah.
a lot of radon tests, I'm guessing here.
Yeah. As far as our, service and testing that we offer, radon is, one of the more common ones because it is a health safety item. That's clearly documented and known. Usually, and I don't get down into that nitty gritty of the transaction and negotiations, but usually it's hard for a seller to push back on, turning away that negotiation of not doing a mitigation system because, well, now it's disclosed and now we know it.
Yeah.
But Indiana, as far as the country goes, is in a moderate to high zone of radon, just kind of in the state and central Indiana. So you're exactly right. Slab homes, it's not that they don't get high radon levels, it's that in the industry and across the board, there's just not enough of them tested to match the numbers that basements have. And so we have agents that require their buyers to have a radon test regardless of the foundation type. And I'm surprised at how many times those slab homes do have,
Yeah.
a high radon level. So
Yeah.
it's out there and it is that silent item that, the only way to know is to have it tested.
Yeah. So, Trent, just what advice would you have for a seller who's looking to put their home on the market in 30 days? They may not want to, we see this. I've seen it in listings like home inspection on file. Like, seller had a home inspection and it's on the countertop. I've seen that.
Yeah.
But maybe not going to the extent of doing a full home inspection. But what are some pro tips you would advise a friend of yours to say, hey, you're putting your home on the market in 30 days. Make sure you do these things. Just curious what your thoughts are there.
I would recommend starting early. You're not going to be able to get that list of things done in 30 days, and it could be expensive to do it all in 30 days. I think the easiest one is an HVAC service technician cleaning, kind of a tune-up. We go into homes a lot where the system is older, 8 years, 10 years, and there's no service records, no service tags. that really starts to look negative in the buyer and the buyer's agent's mind is, oh, we're obviously going to ask for this. Along with that, they should be replacing that furnace filter, whether
Yeah,
you do it or the technician does it. But that goes a long way of saying, hey, I've had this done and it was 6 months, 8 months ago, not just within the last couple weeks
gotcha.
prior to the inspection. I think then the other thing is, just general upkeep and cleaning. It's surprising how far in an inspector's mind or even that buyer's mind of when you go into a home and it appears to be clean and maintained. It goes a long way in the mindset of being able to then absorb some of those more difficult conversations to say, well, they just didn't know about it. It's not that they're intentionally trying to hide things. It's just they didn't know about it or hadn't gotten there that far. So I think also back up from before you put the for sale sign in the yard, peek your head up into that attic. You can get
Hmm.
a good sense of general conditions, even from a homeowner's perspective, by just putting your shoulders and head up into that attic access.
Yeah,
The big one we're seeing more and more because people are starting to realize the cost of mitigation is high. If we happen to, or you happen to see any kind of animal activity, you can usually pick up on that pretty quick, even if it's a bird or some sort of nesting or, you know, it is a lot better to get that tidied up, cleaned up, and remedied outside of a transaction.
yeah, yeah. Those are some great points, and honestly, not that expensive to
No,
try to mitigate
yeah.
some of those issues. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Anything you can do as a homeowner yourself, because we all know if it's your home, you can do pretty much anything you want within realm, obviously not HVAC, electrical, that kind of stuff. But as far as addressing these items, if you're outside or prior to that negotiable terms and that purchase agreement, there's a lot you can do yourself if you've given yourself enough time.
yeah. Let's flip it. What, as far as buyers go, when you walk and I'm just curious, do you have a percentage of like how many buyers accompany you to the inspection? Are they there with their notepads and videos and or do you do them mostly solo? I'm just curious.
Um, I would say the vast majority the client is attending.
Right.
That buyer is attending at some level. We highly recommend them attend the entire inspection, which for us is about 2.5 hours. But yeah, I mean, they're there. We want them there. A lot of times their agents are telling them to be there.
Right.
And it is very, very helpful, just kind of getting their eyes and hands on what the inspector's seen. Maybe the inspector's pointing it out, saying, hey, let me take you to this furnace and let me show you this, or, the basement, what have you.
Yeah. So what piece of advice do you wish buyers would have more often? I know our brokerage, we have three buyers agents, and we're always trying to advise them that, okay, if you want to make an offer on this house, think about these things for your inspection, right? And
Yeah.
if you want to buy this house, think about these things, because they are different depending on age and if a resident's been in there or if they're currently occupied, things like that. But what's the one piece of advice that maybe you even give buyers while you're walking with them through the house, but you wish they were kind of more equipped to handle, because psychologically, this is a very emotional time for people in some cases, especially if they're going to be living there. But what piece of advice do you wish they had prior to having that inspection done?
I think they should go into it knowing that the report is going to be potentially lengthy. You
Yeah,
know, I think a buyer needs to know that a home inspection report, I don't think I've ever seen one under 20 pages,
right.
and buyers don't do this as often as you or I or your buyer agents. And, a 40, 50, 60, 70 page report is, relatively common. And so I think letting them know that there are certain licensing requirements that we're required to identify or include in a report that a lot of times even buyer agents don't understand why we're doing that. And it's
Hmm.
like, well, because it's my licensing.
Yeah.
It's not because we love long reports. If we could do our job and only have 20-page reports, we would love it. That's just not the nature of homes. That's not the nature of our current culture and home knowledge and maintenance. you know I say these kids, but even older generation adults, they just don't have the knowledge, maybe the proper tools. They've not been taught how to maintain a home. And then we go in with our high level state requirements, and yeah, we've got to point out drain stoppers, and we've got to point out garage door functions, and smoke detectors, and all these things that really nobody blinks an eye at when they're living in the home. But now that we're under a microscope and scrutinizing this home, the buyer wants everything identified.
Yeah.
Don't miss a single thing. Well, then it's going to reflect in that length of report. So I think letting them know that reports intentionally are going to be detailed, thorough, which means maybe long, and there's going to be the vast majority of those items and conditions that are deferred maintenance,
Yeah.
but I can't leave them out of a report. That
Yeah.
gets me in trouble pretty quick.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's good stuff. I mean, your job is to find problems. That's why you're there, right? To represent the buyer and say, you know, you can move forward, but you need to be aware of these issues, or ask the seller to do them, or get a concession, or there's obviously many ways these
Yeah.
deals fall out. So last question, we talked about radon already, but are there any other local quirks that buyers and sellers need to be aware of regarding central Indiana homes that, they may not be used to seeing? I can't think of any, but I'm just curious if you know of any.
Yeah. When I was reading through this, the first one that came to my mind is water softeners.
Hmm.
I just had a conversation, with a young couple buying a house, and it didn't have a water softener. And they're like, well, how important is that? And I was like, well, it is really important. Central Indiana is one of the world's highest volume producers of limestone. And so our water table sits on top of and in and through that limestone. And so we have a high content of that in our drinking water. What that does is it deteriorates and reduces the useful life of all your plumbing devices. And most common, it's water heaters, dishwashers. Then it gets into shower heads and plumbing valves and all of that. And so it's somebody that's moving into the state or into the area, from the southern part of the United States. They have no concept of what a water softener is, or why, or what's it do, and how I have to put salt in it. So, that's something that, we identify. It's hard to test and regenerate that water softener during the inspection, but we can generally get an idea of, is it currently being used? Has it just been disconnected, unplugged? Is it leaking? Is it draining properly? Those kind of things. But when I think central Indiana, water softeners.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We live near downtown and we do have a water softener. I've had a water softener every place I've ever lived. And when you can tell if we use a lot of water, maybe in a certain day, then it starts to get hard because the softener has a certain amount of, water it softens at a given time before it recharges at night. You can tell when that water goes hard. I mean, you can just feel on your skin. It is a very big difference. And yeah, I think that's a great point. Landlords don't love water softeners because it's something else to maintain.
Yeah.
But I do think it's a great competitive advantage because there'll be residents that really would appreciate a water softener. Now, I think it's incumbent on them to keep the salt in there and keep it working, because that's a consumable, just like light bulbs and anything else that a resident should be responsible for. But yeah, there's no doubt. That's a great point, Trent, that water is very hard here in central Indiana.
Yep.
And softeners are, look, there's a lot of homes that don't have water softeners, but they don't enjoy the water as much as someone who has a softener, because it makes it a lot nicer.
And for the landlord side of it, and it is an added cost, but it is a selling point.
Yeah.
It is keeping that tenant longer, right? But if that landlord can think of it as an investment concept, maybe you don't have to replace that water heater more frequently.
Yeah,
You
it's a
can
great
get that
point.
water heater to last another 2, 3 years or more. You're not dealing with shower heads gunking up or dishwasher. So it's a long-term goal.
Yeah.
With that, it is a livable comfort conversation as far as your soap suds. You don't get water spotting on glasses and kind of that stuff. But it is an investment side to those other major components.
Yeah. Well, Trent, I really appreciate you coming on here. How do people reach you if they want to engage your services?
Yeah, our phone number is posted all over the place, but you find us at housemaster.com. You can get to our local office just by putting in the zip code of where you're looking for homes. And so housemaster.com even has online scheduling, so you can
Nice.
see our calendar availability and timeframes right up front, and then all the services we provide. Right now, the phone number is still kind of the main stream of incoming inspections. So that 317-209-9100 gets to us, and we can take care of about anything and everything that falls under that inspection process.
Well, that's great. Again, I appreciate you being on here. I think you've given some really good practical advice, and I think our listeners have benefited from this. And again, thanks for being here, Trent. Appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate it. Great opportunity. Thank you.
We hope everyone has picked up some information that will help them in their investing. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another podcast. In the meantime, thank you so much for listening, and please stay invested in your investment.